Bennett, who's been the improvement advisor to this program throughout, has been a great problem solver in his day. He's been a great problem solver with us and for all of you, and I know he'll continue in that role for the rest of his life, because we've got a very close bond with him now. So I want to hand over to him, and he will run the session until afternoon tea.
Great.
Cool, Brandon.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, good to see you. I've been reflecting on all the presentations that the teams have made thus far, and I have to say that it's been real exciting to see the several things. One is the enthusiasm locally to make a difference, to do something differently and to make a transformational change. And certainly what we just observed at Dunedin is really something. I was just reflecting with Suzanne that we had the opportunity to visit the hospital back in June 2012. And at that time, I remember it was very difficult for the team there, really getting things started. And I remember talking with Carla specifically about how do we get momentum to do something differently. And so to see a presentation like the one we just observed with the videos there and the enthusiasm in place is really fantastic. And I think one of the things that's a take-home message for me that I'm excited about is observing that enthusiasm and that local knowledge for how to change has been developing over the course of the last year and a half. And what you now have is reusable skills, so that if you want to tackle ventilator-associated pneumonias, or you want to go after urinary tract infections or any other critical issue that you identify in your institution, you have new skills about how to engage people, how to secure buy-in, how to get started on mapping a process, how to use data effectively to drive improvement, and so forth. And to me, that's just wonderful, really exciting. So round of applause for all of you for developing those skills. I think, well, I'll do it, okay. So. Great. So the topic of the afternoon is holding the gains. So we've managed to have some gains, and we saw this morning Suzanne presented us with some nice time between data. We'll see that again a little bit later in this presentation. And we have seen an indication that we have reduced the number of CLABs in New Zealand, which is very exciting. The question is, can we sustain what we have achieved, and actually maybe even a challenge, can we take it further? Can we actually go further than we have? And so that's really where we're going in this, and I think what we want to build on is the expertise that you all have, that you've developed during the time that you've been part of this campaign. And so with that, I want to start off with where we were at our last learning session, where we left off. We left off with the idea of implementation. Right, so we left off with a challenge, and I think that one of the final sessions that we had was for each of you as teams to develop a PDSA cycle around implementation. What's one thing that you could move towards making permanent in your institution? That was where we left off. And we left off with some thinking that came out of the improvement guide and in the form of this table, and we were looking at where are we as teams with regard to the insertion bundle and with regard to the maintenance bundle and the various process improvements that we were trying to make locally. And we left off trying to learn about and think about how ready are our staffs to make a permanent change. We wanted to think about ourselves locally, how much evidence, what degree of belief do we have that the changes that we want to make permanent are legitimately an improvement, that they are a transformation of the status quo. And then, of course, what's the cost of failure? So if things didn't go right, how detrimental would that be to our improvement efforts? And so we spent some time contemplating this slide. Do you guys all remember this slide? You all saw it. I see a lot of, yeah, okay, good. Well, so this is where we are, and we did decide that there were some things that were ready to move forward and to make permanent. And in seeking permanence or seeking a transformation of the status quo into something new, we contemplated these types of activities. And we looked real specifically at the creation of standardization as being something that was critical to do. We looked at things that would have to change as far as documentation, and we've seen that reflected in several of the presentations today thus far. So we talked about do things like, we've seen the development of forms, for example, but we also want to think about, did people's job descriptions have to change? Anything like that? What happened there as far as making a permanent change to our system? We looked at training, and Carla actually just took us through a change in how Dunedin executes training, right? So now it's a 1-to-3 ratio as opposed to a large group environment, right? Well, the question is that going to be sustained, or is that Carla dependent? That'll be something that Dunedin has to work on, I'm sure. But there is something to be learned about how we train new employees and how we retrain existing employees according to the new process that we have been developing for the execution of the insertion and maintenance bundles. Right? We looked at measurement and how that can change the way that we act, and I'm really delighted to see measures cropping up on all the poster boards that have been brought in and displayed, and actually to hear our lovely team talking about bar charts in their session there. They're laughing up here. That's all right. Right? And then, of course, finally, we talked about, are there permanent changes that need to be made to resourcing? And so we said, part of introducing the insertion bundle or the maintenance bundle and making that a permanent part of what we do every day requires adjusting all of these things as well. That there's all these knock-on effects that exist in our system, and that we have to change if we are to hold the gains, if we are to actually create a different status quo for the future. Right? That's where we left off, and I'm really curious to learn what you did with that and whether or not you were able to accomplish changes in these areas consistent with the clinical pathway changes that you've been making over the previous 12 months or so. So what I'd like you to do for the next 10, 15 minutes or so is break out into your team and discuss some of these things. So what have you done to prevent any backsliding, right? So there's always a danger. We've reached a compliance rate of 95% with the insertion bundle. What are we doing to ensure that we stay there? What is going to keep us from going backwards, right? Because you're going to leave tomorrow, and then guess what's going to happen? Suzanne's going to stop emailing, right? And you're going to be left to your own devices. And there's not going to be heavy pressure from the collaborative to maintain what you've been doing. So what are you going to do? What plan do you have in place? What have you already done in the last 4 or 5 months to ensure that the Hawthorne effect doesn't take over and you don't just start to return back to the previous status quo through backsliding there? Right? So talk about what are the related or support processes that require changing. And when I say that, think about these things. What do we need to standardize? What documentation? What resources, right? Is there, anything that, like, for example, how are we going to resource continually getting these pre-packs in place? Who's going to pay for that? Do we have a line item in the budget now? Has somebody worked that out with the finance department and so forth? Right? All those things have to be changed in order to maintain permanence there. Okay? And then for those things that are not the clinical pathway that you're changing, how do you know that they have in fact changed? How do you know that it's worked? Okay, so I want you to spend some time on that. We're going to come back together and report out, and then we're going to explore several more things. So we're going to kind of go back and forth between a little bit of talking and a little bit of talking at the tables. Okay? Okay, let's come back together here a little bit. All right. All right. Have you started to identify some associated processes or pathways that require intervention or require some permanent changes? I see a head shaking yes. That's dangerous with me because I might ask you what you found. Yeah. All right. Did people find some, or would you care to share what it is that you think also needs to change in order to support a new status quo?
We added it into our infection control plan. Ceiling from Waikato Hospital. In our hospital, we've added it to an infection control plan, part of our surveillance. And then the critical care department, they've added it onto the annual quality plan. So they basically have to report to the quality manager, the clinical board. So it's become real official.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Really?
And yeah. And then it's part of a KPI to the insertion percentage and all.
Okay. Okay. So Waikato has made it something that senior leadership cares about, that they're going to be paying attention to and will be reviewing with some regularity. That's a great way to actually ensure that the momentum will continue to move. That's fantastic. Right? And that required changes that were beyond the clinical pathway. Required you to liaise with the team members who pulled together those things. Great. Anybody else? Other things?
We've put us being educated about the plan and being able to access the database into our orientation package for new nurses. Okay. And unless that package is completed, it's going to be used as evidence towards gaining funding for courses and things like that. So there'll be another reason for them to actually get that orientation package finished.
So it's not done yet?
It's in the package now.
Okay. So help me understand. So that means all new nurses would be exposed to that then?
So every new nurse will get a package.
Brilliant. Excellent. So that becomes that sort of dissociates the old way of doing things from the way that we want things to happen for any future employee that comes in. That's a great way, again, to create a new status quo, to create a level of permanence that otherwise we might slip back into the old ways. Yeah. Great. Well, many of you mentioned a situation where you have some reactions to the change effort over the last 12 months. You mentioned things like some resistance to it, active resistance. We saw that wonderful picture of the two motors on each end of the boat there. I think that's hilarious. I think sometimes I worry about that. Sometimes I worry more about apathy in terms of I could care less. You guys could go about trying to improve this, but I'm really not interested, and I'm not going to pay attention to it, and so forth, right? Right. Well, when people are reacting to change, they can be resistant. They can be apathetic, right? We talked about this, of course, a few months ago, briefly, but the other thing that people could do is they could be compliant, right? We even use that term compliance in our measures, right? But sort of compliance from a psychological perspective is not the same as what we want, which is commitment, right? So compliance is, I might act publicly in one way, but in private, I may undermine an effort that's going on. And I'm sure many of you will have experienced that either professionally or personally, where you were publicly one way or observed other people being one way, but privately maybe disagreed with what was going on and didn't want to perpetuate a new system. So people can be compliant, they can conform, or they can display some commitment. And I guess I'm real curious about this issue of how people are reacting to change and what you've done to address the psychological barriers associated with transformation that you're trying to achieve, right? So in terms of sustaining the change, there are several things that we're interested in. Of course, some of the things that might inhibit us again from sustaining would be that we met our goals. We don't need to pay attention to this anymore. We don't need to pay attention to this, so let's move on to the next thing. Well, could be a huge barrier associated with holding the gains. Okay, we assumed that the improvement would hold, right? Now, nobody might. I don't know anybody who would actively say that out loud. But a lot of people, with regard to their personal lives or their professional lives, will actually act in that way, right? Well, we did something differently for a while, we just figured it would perpetuate itself, right? And I think the reason for that is, and a lot of psychologists who research cognition would say, because that's sort of how we're designed. We're designed to be as lazy as possible. We're designed to not take action if at all possible. So if we have evidence that something will perpetuate itself or that it is performing at a level that we're interested in, we're not inclined to continue working on it, right? That isn't something that we're going to feel easy motivation to do. It requires some discipline and some effort to be put in, right? And that's true of everything from trying to change how much we weigh, to the types of foods we eat, to the work that we do on a daily basis. We're always going to take the path of least resistance. So if we've made an improvement, and we're satisfied that the improvement is in place there, we may assume that it will just continue, right? And not actually take the actions necessary to change the things that are necessary to keep it going. Okay? Another thing that can happen, of course, is that our resources could be diverted elsewhere, right? So we've had resources that have been provided to us for the purpose of this work, either at the national level or at the local level. And now that this work is coming to fruition, people are saying, well, what's the next thing? Is it, what's the next big thing that we need to be paying attention to, right? Is it flow through the ER? Is it perioperative harm? Is it some other issue like ventilator-associated pneumonias? Should we be targeting our money there? Should we be targeting our time there and so forth? Well, I'm not saying those are bad things to do. In fact, they're fantastic things to do. However, they could be a way of robbing Peter to pay Paul if we're not careful. So in the careful distribution of resources, we want to make sure that a change is permanent before we divert resources into something new. And we want to be confident that backsliding won't occur. Okay? One of the things we just heard was that we put it onto the radar screens of senior leadership. We've actually done that. Okay? And what we're trying to do today is to actually get out of this situation where we don't know how to hold the gains, right? So I'm curious about your experience. So what are the barriers? I want you again to talk at your tables here. I want you to discuss these things. What barriers from individuals have you encountered? Right? You'll likely know individual people that you work with who have struggled to adopt a change effort that you've been engaged in. And then there's also the organizational culture. So what barriers within the organizational culture have you encountered? Right? And how have you addressed those? So this gets at the psychology of change piece, right? It doesn't get necessarily at the associated pathways or processes, but it gets at how people act, what the motivation is. How do we get the will to do something differently? So talk about these questions, and I want to hear some feedback on that, because my sense is that several of you will have strategies for addressing them. That over the last 12 months, you've learned something very specific about motivation. You've learned something about how to engage people and how to develop the will to engage the transformation effort that you've been doing. And probably all of us could benefit from hearing from that, because your local learning, while applicable locally, is also likely applicable in situations around the country. So let's spend a few minutes on that, and then we'll come back together. Okay, let's do a quick report out. Are there organizational or individual barriers that people have encountered, and what steps have you taken to address them from a motivational perspective? What things can you share with us that have worked? And been a lot of talking over the last 4 minutes. Suddenly there's silence. Okay.
Just one little thing that we did at Waikato, thing about individuals. So this, when the CLAB first came up, it was given as part of the research portfolio to the newest, newly qualified ICU consultant, and it wasn't going to work out very well due to her temperament, and also just the amount of other stuff that she had to do. So she said, no, I'm not going to do this, and it was given to someone else who was able to give the right sort of approach to it and the right amount of energy.
Okay, great. Others, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think this is a similar thing around organisational culture, in that we've got a very big organisational culture in ADHB that whenever there's a new project, it gets handed to the nurse educators, and therefore then it sends to sit with the nurse educators, and it's been a bit of an ongoing struggle to get it beyond the group and the team that's originally doing it, to actually get it. It is embedded in practice, but the bottom line still comes back to the team members.
What have you done to address that with CLAB, if anything?
Well, we're currently trying to engage more of our senior nurses around taking a little bit more leadership around CLAB, but it is an ongoing discussion with them around their leadership on the floor as much as the educators and the, Marilyn, Helen and I are all nurse consultants, but we've got lots of other things to be doing as well. So it's about sharing the workload and the responsibility for making sure that it's getting done.
I think we've had a culture change too, Brandon. I think originally there were barriers about, hey, this is your baby, oh, here she comes, quick, do your form sort of thing. But now there's an absolute bottoms-up approach. I think everyone in our team would agree that the nurses in the bed space own it now. Hey, Marilyn, we consider this patient high risk. Hey, the doctor didn't quite do what we expected, and I think that's emergency line put in.
What precipitated that? What did you all actively do to encourage that, or did it happen spontaneously?
I think it's a multitude of things. I think it's education, it's working with people, not over them, and I think it's them owning it eventually. Yeah.
For us, I think we saw a big change in our staff nurse group when we started looking at high-risk criteria, because I think they felt we were listening and taking on board what they were saying, and they could see that, oh yeah, this is what we've suggested, it is happening, it's making a difference. And definitely there's been a huge shift. They really actively talk about it now, and it's been great.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things to that. I mean, yes, we've tried to engage the staff nurses as much as we could, and I think what we've tried to do as well, whenever we are on ward rounds, we try and promote, CLAB as well, whether it's the maintenance, compliance, the documentation, or whether it's discussions with people regarding high-risk criteria and that sort of thing. And in terms of, defining high-risk criteria, just to come back to that, we try to engage people as well in various forms. For example, we've got a community of practice electronic Moodle, and where we put out questions. It was just one of the things we did. It's just one example. So really try to engage people. It was one of the key things.
So there are two things that I heard there that make a lot of sense from an organizational psychology perspective, and also from a personal psychology perspective. The first one I heard was that we're listening to people. Right? Well, there's an element of recognition of expertise, of experience when we go about listening, and that allows people to take ownership in ways that previously they wouldn't. So if they didn't feel like anybody was listening, it'd be very, very difficult or impossible to generate a culture where people care enough to do anything independently, unless they're just a highly motivated individual. The other thing that I heard consistently, though, from the Auckland team there was relates real closely to something we call norm theory. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with norm theory, but norm theory has to do with the idea that when we first are exposed to something, we tend to be we tend to push it away, right? And there's norm theory would argue that that's something that's been important to us evolutionarily, right? So that if there's something that new in our environment, then we would be suspicious of it, right? Because it might be a threat to our survival, right? If something persists in our environment for a long period of time, it becomes normal. And as it becomes normal, we become less suspicious of it. In fact, we come to expect it. And what Auckland has done through consistent rounding, talking about CLAB, continual education, has made the idea that we ought to be paying attention to CLAB prevention, something that went from suspicious at first to something that is normal, that is to be expected from the environment, and that is part of our everyday routine when we do that. And I suspect a very similar transformation has taken place psychologically in several institutions. By dwelling on the subject, we've made that something that people have come to expect and are willing to embrace, as opposed to be sort of resistant towards, and that happens over time. So that's great. All right. Any other things people want to share? Yep.
At Wellington, we're also undergoing another change, and that's we're getting a lot more medical research undertaken within the unit now, and which is something that we're all getting quite used to, but we're currently participating in a few more new trials, and there's a new one at the moment called BLING, which is looking at antibiotic administration bolus method versus continuous infusion. And that's really muddying our waters at the moment, because when someone's in BLING, they have daily blood cultures. One set, doesn't really matter where it comes from. Which, when it comes to taking 2 sets of cultures, it's making it different, yet we're still doing the other at the same time. So that makes things very difficult. I also think we need to have enough knowledge about CLAB and our techniques and what we're doing and why. Another challenge that I've had is not everyone agrees with the blood culture policy of having the peripheral samples being taken as well as central. And essentially that comes from the research that came out talking about length of time between first dose of antibiotics and time of death if you delay things. And it was a very good piece of research, and our doctors do not want the nurses mucking around with waiting to have someone to help them take a venous punch if they can't do it themselves. They want that first dose of antibiotics to be given to the patient. Therefore, an arterial sample as a second set of cultures is satisfactory to our team. And that's a compromise that we've had to make. And with our population of patients, I don't believe that the nursing skills with venipuncture are good enough for us all to be doing it ourselves. I don't think we take enough venous punches for us to be skillful, and it's not always suitable to get a registrar to come either, considering they're attending Met calls and going off flying off the floor and everything else. So there are multiple problems, but you can compromise in order to get it all through. But the BLING really is a bit of a problem at the moment. It's getting people to remember CLAB as well as BLING when it comes to taking cultures. So.
Great. So I think, yeah, that's interesting. So you have a second project that is competing for space in people's minds, and that's a very difficult thing to deal with. I think you've also identified several places where maybe continuous improvement could help sort of get us closer and closer and closer to the system that you ultimately desire, which you've identified there. So that's great. Good. Well, wanted to just show you an example of data here of what you don't want to see ever. This would be like the worst possible thing that you would observe happening, and this is what I don't want to happen to you. You're cruising along, and this is not New Zealand data. This is fictitious data that I created. But you've got data here that shows really fair performance in need of improvement, and then you can see that improvement was undertaken and improvement was achieved. Right? And for about a year, there's a real nice observable improvement in the infection rate at this particular institution. And then what happens? It starts to slip away. And it doesn't slip quickly. It doesn't slip all at once. But slowly over time, it slips away, and you return back to a situation where you're at a previous level of performance, right? Well, we'd hate to see that happen. And one of the things that can help us prevent that from happening is the use of data. And we've been using data very specifically in the collaborative over the last 12 months or so. And we saw some of this data presented this morning. We saw the time between CLAB infections across the whole of New Zealand. And we saw a nice step improvement in the time between infections that's expected. Okay. We've also now seen some performance data around the insertion bundle and around the maintenance bundle there, and we have some projections of what we can expect in the future, right? What this data tells me is that while there has been improvement, there's still a long way to go, right? So if I look at this data real carefully, it shows me that from the maintenance bundle compliance for the whole country, we're not talking about any one DHB in particular, but for the whole country, we're hovering at around 70% compliance, 71% compliance, right? And that's what I can expect out of New Zealand next month, and the month after, and the month after that, right? Unless we could continue to work on improving that, right? Well, I also know that I can expect about 83% compliance with the insertion bundle for the whole country, right? Now, if I'm in a position of leadership or I'm sitting around one of the tables, I have to ask myself a question: am I happy with that? Is that something I want to, just keep as a steady state and monitor and avoid a situation that looks like this, right? Or do I want to get better? Do I think if I push this number to 90% and I push this number to 90%, that I'd see this number go quite a bit higher? Right? That I'd see the time between CLAB infections in the country go quite a bit higher. I think we would. I think if we saw insertion and maintenance compliance across the whole of New Zealand jump up above 90%, that we'd see very long times between CLAB infections across all DHBs. But my point is this: the availability of data and looking at data is in and of itself a way to motivate for change, to motivate for work to be done. Right? In the absence of data, which is where we were a short 14 months ago, we had no sense of performance. We had no idea how we were doing across New Zealand, and for many of us, even within our individual DHBs. So the mere presence of data gives us an opportunity to take action that previously didn't exist. And so I'm curious about how you'll use data into the future. We want you to hold the gains. Some of you, your compliance rates are already up there. How are you going to hold on to that? So how are you using data to support the new or emerging status quo locally, right? We know that we're getting it nationally. We know that we're looking at it and feeding it back and so forth, right? But how are you using it locally to drive your efforts, okay? What data are you reviewing? Are you just looking at things like maintenance and insertion bundle compliance data, or are you looking at other things associated with the care pathways that you're trying to change? Okay? How frequently is the team reviewing that data? Okay? So how frequently are you getting together? And who's doing that? Is it the quality improvement team? Is it the senior leadership team? Right? Who all is getting a chance to look at that data and make some decisions about what to do based on it? Okay? So, and are you using that? So I'd like you to take maybe 4 or 5 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll, again, do a little bit of a report back. All right. It suddenly got quiet in here, so I figured that was a good opportunity to dive in. So what do people think about the use of data? So what are some of the realizations here? What are some of the realizations people are having about the use of data? Yeah.
Just wanted to share a bit of data that we review every month that we're very fortunate to be able to do. I'm sure everyone reviews their maintenance data, but we actually review how many times paired blood cultures are taken. So we're very fortunate that our laboratory can pull out all the ICU blood cultures and send us a list monthly, and it'll tell us whether 2 sets were taken or not. And that's part of our blood culture criteria. And so it helps that compliance with whether or not they've actually taken 2 sets.
So that helps you sort of with a validity question, sort of, are we pursuing the investigation the way that we need to be? That's fantastic. Does anybody else do that? Does anybody else look at that information? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. No, don't have much choice. Great. So maybe given that I think 6 DHBs just raised your hand, are there DHBs that aren't, right? Are there DHBs that are not yet looking at that data on a regular basis? You might not be willing to admit it publicly. That's okay. If you are not, it might be worth having a conversation with one of these guys to think about how do they get access to that information, and could that be helpful to you, useful to you, right? Other realizations or ways of using data? Has this project impacted how you think about data and so forth? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Anything more people want to share? Yeah.
We were just saying that in Catherine's talk about doing weekly catch-ups when you're rolling out, and obviously we're doing that with some of our wards at the moment, so we thought that's something that we will try, because we're having just the usual challenges, but something we hadn't really thought of, say a 15-minute weekly chat just about the data, and so I guess that's something that's come out for us today anyway. Yeah. Because we were sort of doing monthly, but we think that might increased vigilance might help.
So you look at it weekly, and Kevin, you also look at it weekly, is that right?
Yeah.
So how has that impacted what you do as a team? So maybe you're looking at the data weekly. Is there any point where you could look at and say, we saw something one week and that caused us to take action or to do something differently, or how has that impacted the way that the team makes decisions?
I think it's very real to people if it happened last week. I think that's one of the things, yeah.
So it feels closer to real time for folks? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Last week was a really bad week, guys. We were really busy, and people, if you're on, you think, yeah, I was there last week. It was busy, but...
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So it doesn't feel so far away, right? Yeah. There's that element of recency. Catherine, any reflections on the experience here?
I think we developed going to weekly because the monthly we were behind. It was right a month before we knew that we'd done annual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know. But we weren't doing well. We had a month worth of habits forming before we had a chance to jump on top of it and discuss it. So by viewing it weekly, we were able to stay on top and actually identify where
So that makes a lot of sense to me. Maybe for both teams, what data are you looking at weekly? Is it the compliance data? Is it the 2 blood culture data? What are you looking at? That's both. So you're getting that data frequently enough to see it weekly and see changes. Okay, great. Same for you guys? Blood cultures monthly and compliance data weekly? Okay, great. So again, maybe an emergent, really good practice here for other teams. This idea of huddling around the data on a weekly basis can, as a form of forced reflection on our practice, could be real helpful. Right? Great. So I think holding the gains can be quite difficult. The truth of the matter is that all man-made systems are prone to degrade. They all do, right? I'm walking around with a phone in my pocket that has just crossed the 2-year threshold, right? I love this phone. It's the favorite cell phone I've ever had. But it's not working anymore. It doesn't work the way it used to work, right? And why is that? Well, because nothing we make can work perfectly forever in perpetuity, unless we pay attention to it, and we update it and so forth, right? Like your car. You can't drive your car indefinitely without getting involved and doing some maintenance on it, right? Well, what do you have in your car that causes you to pay attention and take action as far as maintenance is concerned? You got all those warning lights. You got all those dials on the dashboard, right? You know when you need more petrol because the petrol gauge is empty. You know when you need to take it to the mechanic because the check engine light comes on. You know when you need to add water to the radiator because the heat indicator is going off the scale there and so forth. Well, we need a mechanism for paying attention to our systems to take regular maintenance action on them to make sure that we maintain the performance that we're interested in. And I think the message here as far as holding the gains goes, we need the data to help us do that. And we need to be looking at it regularly in a monitoring way if we've achieved the performance we're interested in. And then we need to be prepared to take the action necessary to generate the new changes that will be necessary to deal with our evolving environments, right? So your locality, your staff, your system is changing around you right now. Right? And as it does so, it's going to have unintended consequences on the performance of what you've been working on the last 14, 15 months or so. And so we got to have a way to detect that, and then we have to have a way to take action on that. And I think you've learned a lot about taking action, and you learned a lot about detection, but putting that to use with regularity is going to be real critical. Right now we have a opportunity to take action on a coffee break. So we're going to take a break here.